Okay. Hi, everyone. I welcome you to this installment of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who we admire, who write on human-animal relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Haris, and my co-host Anu Pande is also here. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are writing or thinking about animals in India. Today we have with us Bhrigupati Singh from Ashoka University. We're going to talk to Bhrigu on a particular chapter from his book, Poverty and the Quest for Life. The chapter is called Divine Migrations, Neighborliness Between Humans, Animals, and Gods. The conversation is very open-ended, so please feel free to ask a question at any point, raise your hand or post your question in the chat box. Please do not hesitate or wait till the end to ask if you have a burning question or a comment. Yeah, so I thought, Bhrigu, we could jump right into some of the big questions and also maybe have talk a bit about, so that it's a sort of an introduction for the people who are attending the talk but maybe haven't had a chance to read the book. So I thought maybe you could tell us about how this, the concept that drives the book, the concept of agonistic intimacy, how that is formulated in a way that dresses, post-colonial concepts or any kind of typical traditional understanding of community or what the local is and so on.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Anu. So firstly, thanks so much for inviting me to this forum. It's really wonderful to see such a kind of creative thought process, and to participate in it is really an honor. So thank you for inviting me. I don't not necessarily think of myself as an expert on animals, but as one of the small conceptual footnotes that I have in this chapter that you read for today, I say that the word jati is often translated as caste, but it can be translated as species. And in some renderings, some scholars would say that jati is better translated as species rather than caste. So in that sense, I would say that in some ways we all write about animals. So in that way, I guess we're all experts at some level from whatever vantage point we enter. So I'm thrilled to be here and to talk to you about this particular chapter of the book. And it's really nice when one writes a book, you hope that it will kind of generate thought, of course, but you can't predict what will be of interest to whom. And it's been really nice to see sometimes people from very far away, NGOs will write a letter saying that we stopped our anti-superstition campaign after reading this particular chapter that we're discussing today. So it's nice to have kind of sense some of the different ways in which the conversation continues. For today, I think, so I won't summarize the chapter since I know that everyone won't have read it, but hopefully through Susan and Anu, they can get glimpses of what it's about. But just to give you a very brief sense, in case you haven't read it, it is on a particular deity in the area where this book is based in Rajasthan, southeastern Rajasthan, Shahabad, on the border of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh in central India. And the deities, the chapter is about Tejaji, who would be called an oral epic deity and part of the corpus, larger corpus across India, Pakistan. And then in the chapter, I argue that it's part of a much larger complex of divinities. Tejaji is not to be understood, would often be described as a Rajasthani folk deity, but I kind of take distance from the term Rajasthani and folk and try to situate the deity in a larger understanding of comparative religion, but also of Hinduism, because one of the things I'm saying is that the understanding of Hinduism itself has often been taken as too stable a set of divinities. And what you see with Tejaji as a new deity in this particular area, entering this area through spirit possession, I try and show how that's not just a phenomenon of tribal or Dalit experience, but it actually can be understood per se. Even in the most major history of Hinduism, one would understand, say, Krishna as a deity who's a pastoral herd, kind of a small pastoral deity who rises into significance. So just to situate the chapter in terms of sort of comparative religion, but not only religion, one of the crucial things in the book is, I guess, the relation between religious and secular ideas. And so in that sense, Susan's opening question that could I speak about agonistic intimacy is maybe the central concept of this chapter and one central concept of the book. And basically to introduce the concept, it comes from the word agon, A-G-O-N, which means contestation or contest culture. And so in many forms of ancient, not only Greek, I mean, Greek are the most famous, say the Olympics would be one form of a peaceful form of war. But agonistic cultures are part of, for instance, Vedic sacrifice as well, where two rivals will confront each other in a sacrifice. So often sacrifice, as we know, or rituals are a playful form of war or a playful form of rivalry. And so in that sense, it seemed to me as a way of thinking about social life, agonistic intimacy offered me one of the central questions for me in writing this book was that I was going to be writing about many different things, but fundamentally at a social level also about, say, intercaste relations or what are called tribal and caste relations. And I myself wanted to find a vocabulary that felt right to me. It didn't matter what other people, the terms they use, including terms like Dalit or Adivasi, which are very recent terms. So I wanted to understand how you understand the relationship between neighboring groups. And so one of the fundamental concepts of the chapter is the concept of the neighbor, and how you understand groups that may have lived together in very long proximity, which doesn't necessarily mean they'll get along. They might hate each other. And as I say at the beginning of the chapter, sometimes the deepest violence globally you see is between groups who actually know each other very well or have lived together for generations. So proximity is no guarantee of peace, but nor is it a guarantee of war. And I wanted to understand relations between neighboring groups, not only in the form of, say, domination resistance, or that here is the upper caste, here is the lower caste, and nothing else happens. But how does one understand power and relatedness? So in that sense, agonistic intimacy offers two seemingly contradictory things joined together, which is agonistics, that is rivalry, contestation, play, violence. And intimacy offers a way of thinking about forms of relatedness. So together, these two concepts, agonistic intimacy, are meant to help us think about relationships between neighbors, which might be in, say, rural India or in Israel or in Greece or in relations, race relations in the US. So it isn't a concept necessarily limited just to rural or urban context. It's equally valid and equally has helped me think about the book I'm writing now, which is set in resettlement colonies in Delhi, where again, then neighbors with very strong caste-based identities in how the neighborhoods are organized and who've known each other, say, for 3 generations as neighbors. So in that sense, it was an alternative to some of the dominant paradigms in social theory, like agonistic, like domination resistance, and or also the opposite, which would be simply some notion of communitarian ideals of living together, etc., which I find also not so helpful because it's usually often it's wishful thinking that people should just get along and live in fraternity.
Yeah, when I was reading the chapter, especially because I was thinking about animals, I did get the impression that maybe when we think about animals, one of the synonyms for agonistic intimacy perhaps could be some kind of tolerance. And I was wondering what you think of that, because it's not very connected, but I was reading Simone Weil's Iliad, or the poem of force, where she's talking about force as this condition of human life, and force as something that every human has to deal with. But it seemed like in the way agonistic intimacy was working in your chapter, it seemed like it was taking a kind of long historical view. And because it was taking a long historical view, it could look at different moments of force or say violence and take that as part of the waxing and the waning. So, would you, so if that is then true, then tolerance or agonistic intimacy, and I don't know if you agree with if that is a synonym at all, then that kind of agonistic intimacy could stand in for just the way social relations are in any part of the world or in any part of rural India. What do you think?
No, thank you. That's I mean, two or three very interesting suggestions. One is the reference to Simone Weil, who's the particular book you're referring to, her that really stunning first line in her reading of the Iliad, where Simone Weil says the Iliad is a poem of force, and then proceeds to think about the category of force. I had found that I read it much later, more recently. I mean, I encountered her interpretation of the Iliad much after this writing on oral epics. But basically, I found it very resonant in thinking about epics as basically doing something that is theological in some way, that is enabling a transformation of force. And so in that sense, the argument I make in this chapter that the Mahabharata can be read as sort of like doing something similar as, say, the Bible or many Buddhism, which is basically that a certain idea of force is being recast entirely. And in that sense, some of the epics are sometimes describing a sort of dissolution, or like the Mahabharata says that this is the movement from one era to the next, or like the Iliad says that or Hesiod says that the era of heroes is over. So in some ways, it is an epic issue, but I would say it's also very much an issue of politics. For example, what I would think of as one of the great texts of modern Indian philosophy would be Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. And I briefly mentioned in the chapter that basically the central, in some ways, if we read Hind Swaraj as doing a conceptual, not only being about railways and Britishers and stuff, but conceptually it has a crucial task it sets for itself, which is what it calls the transformation of brute force into soul force. So I think the category of force and how that's transformed is both a theological and a secular problem. The question of whether living together can be named as tolerance is something I was hesitant about, because one of the anthropologists who sort of, as I was writing this article, one of the anonymous reviewers of the book had said that you really need to read this other person called Robert Hayden, who writes on his term as antagonistic tolerance. And I was told to differentiate agonistic intimacy from that. The reason I hesitate over tolerance is that it's always felt like it has a very pejorative feeling. I would rather be hated than be tolerated. And so tolerance has the feeling of something that is sort of, it's a kind of benign superiority of a sort. So, which is not to say that it's not relevant. It would be, say, constitutionally very relevant, or it could be relevant as an ideal of a sort, that there are things we may find repugnant, but we may have to live with. So in that sense, I think it's a very fruitful thing to think further about. And the loss of tolerance would be kind of something very important to say how contemporary democracies are transforming. But I would say that in terms of animals, or in terms of how one thinks about the relation or the traversal of force between animals, in the epic context, it seemed to me that different animals were, like one of the questions I ask in the chapter, that how do animals leave their tracks in divine human relations? And so in the Tejaji epic, one of the sort of the two major animals are the snake and the cow. And in my current fieldwork in Delhi, for example, I realized that a crucial urban conflict is between pigs and buffaloes. And that is a better way to understand certain kinds of lower caste Muslim antagonisms. So I would say animals have a very strong force in human relatedness, in which tolerance would certainly be a question. I would say an important question of, say, how people understand or live with pigs, for example, which are considered repugnant in a lot of Hindu and Muslim social formation, but are an absolutely central part of, say, particular lower caste ways of life. So in that sense, I think it opens out an interesting question, and one would have to think more on what the cultivation of tolerance would be, for example, or how one learns to tolerate. But in this chapter, I was more interested in the category of force. But I think maybe tolerance would be one form in which you cordon off a force or create a boundary of a sort, and make yourself separate from that force, possibly.
And yeah, I was thinking about that in relation to the Schmidt definition you use of politics as this conflict that is fought in order to preserve one's own form of existence. And you're talking about that in relation to the deities and how, you know, they come into fashion and then they fall out of popularity. And so are these, so I suppose the scale is epic and mythic, but the politics that is here that lets a deity fall out of popularity, is that historical or local and therefore subject to politics as it plays out amongst people?
This is, I think, a very, sometimes a very simple question is actually quite a difficult one. I would say it's a difficult question you ask. In two parts, I think I could answer the Schmidt question first, that basically in this chapter and some of these chapters, or in the book as a whole, what I was trying to get away from, is that sometimes a very simple, if implicit distinction occurs, that we think of politics as contestation, or as Foucault said, or building a Clausewitz, war by other means. So politics becomes some form of war or conducting war by, say, non-violent means, while ethics becomes, the idea of ethics becomes connected to some striving for peace, or something that's the opposite of war. So I wanted to find a definition or some midpoint between politics and ethics. And that, for me, the term agonistics or agonistic intimacy also was somewhere a midpoint between politics and ethics, so that politics is not necessarily only about war and ethics is not only about peace, but about different forms of contestation that can be, say, ethical. Now, in this, the other thing that Schmidt does is to create sort of the concept of the political, famously, as the distinction between friend and enemy. And so again, in this chapter, the idea of the neighbor is somewhere as a midpoint between friend and enemy. Neither quite friend nor quite enemy, nor quite self nor quite other. So in this kind of zone between sort of polarities, what place do deities have? Or how does the rise and fall of particular deities affect, say, social and political formations, if we were to say? That being the second part of your question. And in that, I would say that, for example, the first part of the chapter describes the fall of Indra and the rise of Krishna. And in that sense, I realized that basically often we are just unaware of the geographical reach of deities. So as Dumezil, the comparative mythologist I was citing, points out, that Indra was also the leading deity of Iran, for example. And one of the primary attacks that Zoroaster, or the rise of Zoroastrianism, was also involved in demotion of Indra. And the same thing happened in South Asia or in India in a different way through the rise of Krishna. And in that, basically, at least in the understanding we have of mythology and what its relation was to political social formations, it seems to be a very direct reordering of power relations, very much in the way that, say, in Christianity or the history of Christianity, somebody like Peter Brown, who's one of the leading historians of Christianity, would make the argument that Christ, or that basically saintly shrines to which Christianity began, were an absolutely direct attack on Rome, and spatially and politically, and shows it through evidence in a way of a sort that historians can offer, which is that if you look at the spatial distribution of ancient Rome, sacrifice was in the central part of the city, while Christian saintly shrines being formed on the outskirts of the city with very much outcast social groups, etc., was a direct attack on the central the absolutely central political formation. So in a similar way, I would say that now if one were to understand that what the rise of a particular deity, which even if the deity remains the same, that you take somebody like Tejaji, and the same thing can be converted into, say, Tejaji as a cow protector. Then what you have is an attack on, or if Tejaji is still sort of primarily related, even in the iteration I'm writing about, to Hindu social formation. But you take the same thing with, say, Ramdev Peer or many of the oral epic deities that cross over between Hindu-Muslim formation, then I would say that the transformation of deities can very directly have an impact on neighborly relations between, say, if we were now to call them Hindus, Muslims, or we were to call them, as opposed to where in the oral epics, I'm trying to show you that basically the epics themselves are depicting really a situation of war between, say, even in Tejaji, between Jats, Meenas, and Gujars, the three dominant pastoral communities of the time. And even now, the Jats are the largest demographic population in Rajasthan. So I would say that it is very much, I would say that myth is not something that's rarefied or that's something separate. The transformation of myth can have a very direct impact on how social antagonisms are understood, or how one understands what is happening socially and politically. Even in the time of Indra and Krishna, and even now, I would say it has a very strong, plays out in social and political worlds in a very direct way. So in that sense, I think it's an important thing to think about how deities rise and fall. But it's not only a social or political phenomenon. Also, is what I'm trying to show. Let's say the rise of Ganesh, or what I'm saying now are the third generation of Hindu deities, or the fourth generation, if we would take Indra as the first. And then this current generation of deities can also be a relation to Tejaji, for example. I'm saying also rises because he displaces a previous deity within that area, who's a snake bite healing deity. Also because it's a new form of sound and experience and music. So it need not only be a political transformation, it can also sometimes be an aesthetic transformation. Just as certain styles of music fall out of fashion and new styles of music come into being. So in that sense, deities, I would say, have many different aspects of what would constitute their rise and fall. But I would say if there's one thing that I wanted to, that an insight I arrived at in this essay, it was that basically Hinduism has been wrongly understood, to put it bluntly, as simply a Sanskritized fixed thing with these particular deities being the high and these being the low, when basically the whole complex is of a movement between high and low and the emergence of new gods, etc. So in that sense, I would say that it has a political dimension, but it is also may have an aesthetic and many other kinds of relations to how deities rise and fall.
That's very interesting. Anu, go ahead.
Thank you, Susan. So, Bhrigu, I am still thinking about agonistic intimacy. I guess I need to read the chapter before the one we are discussing today to really understand how you use it, how you think of it. But I have been, since this talk started and since earlier, about its applicability, as Susan also brought up, to the examination of multi-species relations or human-animal relations. And I guess I need to think more about that. But if you have more to add on that, whether this is applicable, given the fact that in your chapter you also mentioned this episode of speaking to somebody who, where the cow goes missing and the calf is crying and is miserable. and won't eat, and the daughter of the household also doesn't eat, there is that level of intimacy that crosses species boundaries, so to speak. Um, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, whether this is something that one could use as a tool to examine human-animal relations. And the second thing was, you've also written about when any of the Saharias are possessed by Tejaji, then they are supposed to abstain from drinking alcohol and eating meat, because these are considered gandagi, so forms of pollution. And you've talked about how you do not see this as or through the lens of imitation. So for the benefit of those of us who have not read the chapter, I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. How do you see it?
Yeah, thank you so much. So both questions are, I think, helpful to clarify and elaborate on. The first one, I would say that when you refer actually to the chapter before this one that we are discussing today, that's where the concept of agonistic intimacy begins. You're absolutely right. And that chapter is called Erotics and Agonistics, but the ritual mainstay of it is the festival of Holi. And I think in this pair of chapters, it was like suddenly so many things of what is called Hinduism became clearer to me, including Diwali, for example, which is often linked to the Ramayana and victory of Ram, etc. I realized that the central, in many places still, the absolutely central ritual of Diwali has nothing to do with Ram, but is to do with Govardhan Puja, which is very directly about Krishna defeating Indra. And mythically, of course, retold, but to do memorializing that fall of a particular kind of deity and the rise of a different one. Similarly, with Holi, I understood it. The concept of agonistic intimacy I actually got from playing Holi in that form and understanding what it means for every household in a village to give one panda, whatever, one cow dung cake to a collective fire. And what it means to temporarily cease certain kinds of hostilities, to eat together, and then to also play in this slightly violent way that Holi is still played in different places. So the idea of agonistic intimacy as it relates to neighborhoods very much came to me from Holi. So I think it's very nice of you to bring up that chapter, because that description of Holi is what gave me the idea of agonistic intimacy. Whether agonistic intimacy can be extended to think about human-animal relations, I think yes, absolutely yes. What one would need to think about, intimacy is easier in some ways to write about, precisely in the ways you're describing, that one can see, I mean, any number of so-called companion species where you have certain kinds of affective relations, very much in the style, in the way you mentioned in the chapter, which happens in some ways. It was nice to see the Gajananji and his daughter is not eating because the calf is lost, and the calf is crying for her mother. And then the myth has the same, the brothers are cursed because they separated a calf and the mother. And then Gajananji says, I'm going to swim and find her because, and kind of says to Tejaji that you found the cows, let me find my cow. So like that, one can see affective relations which are strong at times in species one lives with in close proximity to. And that's in some ways not surprising, but it is a domain of how one would understand those forms of intimacy better if one adds the question of agonistics or of distance from it. That even in human kinship, even when we understand, people who study kinship carefully take it to be not only a domain of love and tears, but a domain of deep violence. So anyone studying kinship in any part of the world understands that it's a realm of intimacy and injury. And intimacy and injury are closely tied together. So how would one extend that into the domain of the human or the animal relation? I think would be a question to consider if one takes certain kinds of agonistics also might be understood among proximates. That is to say, you might understand certain disputes over territory between humans and animals very much to be a form of agonistics. But I would say that one of the things I've begun to think about in my recent fieldwork also is that what is it that when do we say that it ceased to be an agon? That is to say that even in human relations, you could say that, say in Sri Lanka, Tamil-Sinhala relations till a certain point were an agon. There was a rivalry, contestation. From the 1980s onwards into like the 2000s, and with Rajpaksha and all, we can say it ceases to be an agon. It's not an agon anymore. It is a form of decimation. So when you're decimating your so-called rival, and it is basically a form of bullying and decimation, then it's not an agon anymore. There's no agonistics left. So a lot of Tamil-Sinhala relations in Sri Lanka, I don't think at a certain point the agon transformed into something else. And something similar is happening in India, has been happening in India, but more intensely so now in the last, say, 10, 15 years, that till a certain point, say Hindu-Muslim neighborhoods, if we call them that, they could also be understood as neighboring lower caste neighborhoods, that is lower caste Islam, lower caste Hindu, could have been understood as an agon. And at some point it ceases to be an agon. So similarly with human-animal relations, one might say that there are certain forms of agonistics that you may say is still agonistic. At a certain point, it ceases to be agonistic. It is a decimation. So I would say that one of my recent interests after this book is that how does one understand that threshold where you say the agon is ending? So in that sense, I would say human-animal relations certainly could be understood in relation to intimacy, agonistics, but also the end of agonistics, where it is not a contestation anymore, but certain kind of decimation. The last thing you asked on Tejaji and Gandagi, which is to say that usually the way one would understand that basically it is one of the most common things to happen in tribal and lower caste India all over the country, which is that what is called a Bhagat movement sometimes, or that basically a group will convert within Hinduism from a non-vegetarian diet to a vegetarian diet and adopt this language of purity. And it is usually understood in the chapter I outlined. There are basically two ways in which it's usually understood. One is imitation, that is Sanskritization, like I mentioned, Srinivas, that is copying upper caste norms. And the second is imitation, the opposite of it, which David Hardiman and subaltern studies people have tried to say is opposition, that it is a capitulation to upper caste norms, but as a form of opposition, or as, so that's David Hardiman's argument in The Coming of the Devi. I would say in Tejaji, I'm trying to understand basically, firstly, it's not a group phenomena. So it's not like everyone will convert to vegetarianism. It will be that basically the spirit medium, in order to receive Tejaji, will undergo certain kinds of ascetic practices and give up certain forms of diet. Some of it may be in the language of purity, but it doesn't work as a form of imitation, I'm saying, for a number of reasons. Firstly, that within a household, for example, it's not that everyone will have to become vegetarian. So the one, I interview many spirit mediums, but the one I follow, his wife remains whatever her diet may have been, doesn't convert to vegetarianism. His father-in-law is a famous shikari hunter. So in that sense, I wanted to offer the argument that it's neither imitation nor opposition, but what in the chapter I call a form of becoming. That is that the main thing that happens with this in the spirit medium I follow and understand the experience of becoming a Tejaji medium is that, for example, he begins to dance like a snake and has a huge following of people who come to see him writhe like a snake in a very powerful river during the Teja Dashmi festival and at other moments. And the way in which upper castes would sort of, or the whole village would pay respect to that spirit medium and the entry of Tejaji into the village has very little to do with that spirit medium being vegetarian or not. That's one of the preconditions to being a Tejaji spirit medium, that you have to follow A, B, C rules. But the rules don't necessarily define whether you'll become a like well-known spirit medium or not, or whether the kinds of intensities and cures and forces that you're expressing will not follow logically just by becoming vegetarian. So in that sense, I wanted to show that it's neither imitation nor opposition, but something else. It is a form of becoming, both for the spirit medium and for the village, which reorganizes social relations, spatial relations, festivals. Like a festival is a very expensive thing to host. And so for the whole village to offer contributions, to create a festival, to reorganize space so that a shrine can be created, etc., that is a lot of collective labor as well. So in that sense, I would say that it is a form not of, it isn't just that there's some copying of some Brahminical norms that is going on, because in any case, Tejaji is not Brahminical, is a Jat. And vegetarianism is one aspect of what I'm trying to show in the chapter, is the theological significance of the cow. And that, I would say, is one realm which very much overlaps with, say, Hindu right thinking as well, which is that Tejaji, what I offer in the chapter, I mean, rereading it even now in preparation for today, I realized that at the time when I was writing it, it was still pre-current regime. And so what the cow would become was still very incipient. But theologically, I would stand by the argument I offer in the book and in relation to Tejaji, that there is a reason why such violence occurs around the figure of the cow. So in that sense, I would say the Gandagi or whatever vegetarianism is not only Sanskritization, but it overlaps with extremely central theological preoccupations within Hinduism.
My question's related to that. I was thinking about, and I'm sure you would hesitate to use concepts like resistance because you warn against talking about power and domination. But when we think about agonistic intimacy, do you think, because it seems like there's degrees of relations and how they engage, how different groups engage with each other. So in that regard, and you also talk about this engagement between the ascetic and the warrior ideals. So I'm wondering if there is a room for resistance and how that would be theorized in this frame. And the other question I had is connected to this, which is your interesting use of species and how, and I'm thinking if species, how we can connect species to the concept of the neighbor and neighborly life forms, because I think on one hand, if species are considered different neighborly life forms, then it is possible for, say, one particular life form from within one species to offer some resistance to the other species. But at the same time, the the taxonomy is such that species is a very limiting frame, and it is also possible that the whole reading is about humans and so tainted with anthropocentrism that it may not be possible for animals or even deities to really mount any resistance that would be registered by these people or by forms of life in places like this.
Thank you, Susan. I would say the first question, or the first part of it, or it's structured around the problem of resistance. I would say that in this, basically, it is the case that to me, the reason why I was wanting to move away from, say, domination resistance was not only because, it's such a common paradigm and let me find something new. It was that basically the social relations I was encountering, I wanted to be able to write about those relationships and those people. So this Tejaji chapter, then the next two chapters after that in the book are about two particular people among the Saharias whom I found to be expressions of what I say, that basically I take ethics to be a nobler form of agonistics, or people who teach you to contest in a more noble way. And what do I mean by that? Then the two lives that one woman and one man, that I try and draw a portrait of them in the next two chapters. To me, they are symbols not of resistance. That is to say, I'm not celebrating them for the fact that they do things that would be like, so Kalli, the woman I'm writing about, for example, is very much involved in, say, bonded labor, agitations, in leading dharnas, but at the same time is doing exactly the opposite in some ways, that the main landed middle caste, who are the main landed gentry of the area, in some ways cultivator caste, when their land comes into forest boundaries, she goes to the forest officials and successfully basically gets their land freed from the forest boundary. So in some sense, I say that that's agonistic intimacy. She did it also to put them into her debt, but she needn't have done that. And so resistance to me would eclipse a lot of forms of experience and of politics and of ethics, so that you don't understand or you take it as an act of corruption, for example. That's how the NGO understood it. Ki, oh, she's gone on to the side of the Kirar, that is the cultivator caste, and she's helping them. When a more, because in the sort of domination resistance in relation to force is kind of like, what in the book I say, Newtonian image of force, that an action has to have an equal and opposite reaction. So then what you miss is the diversification of force, or the many ways in which it might be expressed in forms that you can understand relations between force that may not take the form of resistance. So my resistance to the notion of resistance is that it sets up this kind of for and against kind of situation where you miss a lot of things that are happening. At the same time, a lot of the concepts, as you see in the book, you're right to point out to warrior and ascetic as the second part of your question, which is that there's forms of opposition or conflict that I see as very important, both in social life and as constitutive of how one should understand relationships and kind of movements between different forms. So warrior and ascetic would certainly be one way of understanding, for example, the history of morality. I would say that in trying to understand some of the moral aspects of life, I realized that I don't want to just think of morality as something where you're good or as something where you're striving to be better. And then that's how this Nietzsche's genealogy of morals sort of gives me the clue to what I find to be a richer understanding of morality, which is that, as Nietzsche is saying, that for 2000 years, our notion of morality across so many different religions has come from asceticism, and in Buddhism and Christianity and Hinduism. And as he says, in the 19th century, but now we are seeing the most extreme form of it, that now finally ascetic ideals are receding. And what is in its place is actually some form of what was its opposite, which was the warrior ideal, which was basically some form of understanding capitalism and understanding that kind of conquest or morality of conquest. So resistance, instead of resistance, I would say opposition or the conflict of forces is sometimes what we are seeing. So it's not a totally a term to be kind of cast away, because sometimes warrior ideals may still be in conflict and may encounter resistance in through forms of asceticism or through forms of frugality, etc. So I would say it's still a helpful term, and extending that to species and to the idea of the neighbor in relation to animals or human animals, I would say that again, it would be the case that the danger in thinking of neighbor is that, like with Zizek or like with others in the thing that I'm quoting, it becomes too quickly attached to love. That is, we think neighbor equal to some form of love, but or codependency. That is to say, if there are two species that are codependent on each other, what may exist between them may not be love, but one would have to think of what forms of relatedness that takes. So I would say certainly species, I don't think is a only an anthropocentric concept, particularly the way people still use it sometimes in ordinary conversation. Like I say in the chapter, that when Gajananji tells me that totas, that is the most samajdar jati, most intelligent species are parrots, then he's using the term jati as it is used. That is to say that they are one among other species, as are so the category of human would be relatively not so commonly used. I mean, some may use it in certain forms of speech, but to think of different jatis, including castes, tribes, and non-humans, within a spectrum of jatis is also a way of inhabiting the concept of jati. So in which case I would say that if one were to think of kinship or relatedness, as I'm saying, as a combination of intimacy and injury, and not just as a positive thing, that to be related or neighbor means necessarily that it's positive. So yeah, so I would say, but resistance is still a useful concept, but if you don't pair it with domination.
Krishnanandi.
Hello, sir. Thank you for your work. I wanted to refer back to an earlier paper that you co-authored with Professor Naisargi Dave, where there is an episode that you mentioned about a worker in a slaughterhouse, in a poultry slaughterhouse, who was kicking around an almost dead chicken, and which is a very horrible scene. But then you respond to that scene with the idea of cruelty as play, and I found that very interesting. Very appalling at that point, but then later on I found it to be very true, because especially when you're looking at cruelty, animal cruelty footage that does the rounds, we realize that the whole scope of cruelty, the inventiveness of cruelty, is gathered from the possibilities that play affords. So cruelty as play, and I wanted to ask you to speak more about that particular idea, and especially like how you came across the idea of cruelty being a form of play, or how those two are connected, and also the forms in which cruelty and play manifest in your own fieldwork at present.
Thank you. That's a really perceptive and helpful question. And thanks for bringing up that earlier essay, which was co-authored with an anthropologist called Naisargi Dave, who's an anthropologist but is also vegan, and was writing a book and a set of articles from the perspective of being vegan. And I suddenly thought I'd been reading Elizabeth Costello and some of the debates around that. And I thought that nobody has ever, I myself am omnivorous, and thought that no one has ever made a moral argument for against a vegan, or co-authored an essay with a vegan affirming non-vegetarianism, as we call it in India. So that Naisargi and my essay was sort of initially began from a conference paper that we did in a panel. And then we said, won't it be interesting to write from the perspective of vegan and non-vegetarian, to co-author a paper defending our respective positions and the notion of violence that is very much also part of Elizabeth Costello, on not so much on vegetarian versus non-vegetarian, but the mode of violence and how killing occurs. And then our shared interest became on the mode of killing. But a side plot within that question of the mode of killing is very much what you just asked, which is that how does one understand the notion of cruelty when it isn't to do with consumption, but simply to do with play. And play in the sense that, like, if you've ever seen a cat play with a mouse, a dead mouse, even if it's your own domestic cat, it can be a pretty horrifying sight, because this cat that you thought was so cute and is your domestic companion, you suddenly see it play with a mouse, and you realize that this is quite unsavory form of play. But the fact of the matter is that play does involve many of these forms of cruelty often. And if one doesn't understand that, then one can of course make the argument that this is, unsavory form of play. But a lot of play is better understood when you understand this kind of relation that it has to cruelty. So in the context of my current fieldwork, I realized that this question I was posing earlier of how one understands violence in urban neighborhoods, I realized that what we call riots now, or what I was saying that the agon has become something else. In an earlier generation, I would say, till a certain point of time, I would understand the riot not so much as a riot like the colonial understanding or the governmental understanding of riot, but as a form of what I'm depicting in Tejaji, or what I'm saying Tejaji depicts. That is, his sister says to him that I want to have the milk of a bhuri bhais, brown buffalo. And the brothers say that, but we don't have such a buffalo. She's like, go steal it from the Bagar Desh, that is from Bagswara and Udaipur. They have it. So they go to rob 50 buffaloes from the Gujars. And then the Gujars come and attack them and vice versa. So this form of blood sport or play is something that can very much till recently have been seen in, say, Hindu-Muslim neighborhoods, where you'll have, say, 3 or 4 forms of play, which I hope will be one chapter of mine in the recent, in my next book based in cities in Delhi, which is on different forms of like what is called kabutar bazi, for example. Kabutar bazi is a very important form of play between neighbors in particularly Muslim urban culture. You'll have a set of kabutars that you'll be training to fight in the sky. So like that, you'll have kabutar bazi, patang bazi, that is, you'll be fighting with kites. And like that, I would say what used to be the riot would be one extension of this form of cruel blood sport between neighbors. But now I would say it's not like that. So now when you see violence in the neighborhood, there's no agonistics or contestation or play in it. It is blood sport as decimation. But in a previous epoch, I would say that it did involve this element of play and cruelty as play, and a form of harming an intimate for fun. And this, I think, if we don't understand that, we miss out on, say, the animal element of the human, and reduce the human in scope. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm saying it's a certain condition of being human, that you're still have certain kitten or cat impulses or whatever else impulses. So I would say this play and cruelty relation is very important. And the chicken and the thing was more, that wasn't my part of the essay. It was Nesargi wrote that, because her fieldwork was in slaughterhouses, and she was horrified initially, then writes about how she got over the horror of watching chickens being killed, and then basically has a certain moment where she's pausing over this boy playing with a dead chicken or a half dead chicken, and realizing how important that form of play is.
Thank you, sir. I also felt because, especially when you're looking at animal cruelty footage, and each form of cruelty is very different from the other, and there is such originality in all the cruel acts. So I thought, they must be deriving that scope of possibility from something like play, because it is not really intended towards anything, but it is just done for fun. So yeah, the originality, the inventiveness is I think it's very close to the concept of agonistic intimacy also. Yeah. Thank you.
But I would say, no, thank you for that last afterthought. I would say in this, the crucial thing is, I'm not saying all forms of cruelty are good. I would myself be, say, morally appalled by watching a lynch mob. But I would say from Tejaji, what we can learn is that religious forms of ritual are often, or sometimes at their best, are an aestheticization and ennobling. So to play holy in that form is like what Bakhtin said, that you have certain impulses and you turn it into something beautiful. So basically, many of the theorists of sacrifice are interested in this, like René Girard and many others, then how is this impulsive cruel play made into something beautiful and collective? And often ritual is precisely a channeling of that energy into something where it may take on a much more aesthetic and ritualized form, but is meant to channel those impulses into, say, something that is less cruel or differently playful.
I wanted to follow up on this question, and I was thinking about what you said about the activists earlier, and I'm very interested in animal rights activists. And I was thinking about what role or how you would describe the question of the ethical in your work, because you do use Nietzsche to talk about the genealogy and so on. And I'm thinking, for Nietzsche, I suppose there is a kind of meta ethics that is not the kind of ethics that you can find amongst men. So if one distances from oneself from how one describes ethics, then there is a higher form of ethics to be found or to be extracted, maybe in a deconstructive reading and so on. But I don't think that's what you're going for. Is it such that in like a finer description or in accounting for more variables, one can understand the ethical better? And I was also thinking in relation to activists and your current work among on mental health and so on, where I'm sure you witness to very tangible forms of human suffering. If that kind of fine description of ethics is tenable when we're thinking about human suffering, I mean, would you be more generous and maybe align yourself with an activist who says, these mental health problems in this particular neighborhood are caused by these issues and therefore must be tackled?
No, absolutely. I think, again, a very invitingly simple and complex question at the same time. To try and answer the question in brief, I think if depends on what one thinks an activist might be. But in this, like in my Shahabad book, I was living housed by a couple who both passed away in the years after my field work, but who were the leading activists of the area in the sort of traditional definition of the term activist. And the most enjoyable parts of my whole journey were arguments with them and learning from them and learning how I could work with them sometimes in things that I felt were urgent and very ordinary, like say they were running a school and a set of schools, and in keeping those schools running was sort of a really full-time task for them. But what was going to be taught in those schools is where an anthropologist might take a little bit of distance from an activist. In a certain form, not to say activists are one and the same thing, or that they must think in a certain way, but with them, for example, I had interesting arguments on what their response would be to Tejaji or to other deities, or the part I have at some not in this chapter, but later on in the book, where there's a leading activist of the area giving a speech on how a lamp will light darkness in this area. So sometimes it might be that our ideological distance from sympathy and friendship, but distance might be really important in what we're able to do in relation to activism, both in being part of certain endeavors that one would of course support, but in offering suggestions, since our timeline may be 100 years, or in the case of Nietzsche, 2000 years, rather than the immediacy of 5 years or 3 years. We may do our bit for the 3 years and the 5 years, but our aim may, or our horizon may be a little different than that. And at the most practical level, I would say in this mental health work, for example, I would say it's much more like one of my favorite philosophers says that philosophy is that which remains awake after everyone else has fallen asleep. So it may be that people are doing very hard work in mental health. For example, a lot of people will say that what we need in India is that there are so few psychiatrists. We really need training of frontline health workers in mental health kind of treatment and diagnosis. Now, for an anthropologist, that is a threat and a possibility at the same time. The possibility is that indeed maybe it will be helpful to have people able to treat mental illnesses across the country. The threat is that the treatment in psychiatry itself is so much under dispute that to have people handing out pharmaceuticals across the country would be a kind of give you a little bit of pause, that you don't want sort of upper caste frontline workers handing out anti-anxiety, antidepressants to rural areas across the country. So I think the activist work, if we are thinking of it as something that's sort of frontline interventions of a sort that one would be sympathetic to, I would say that it is a careful relationship of agonistic intimacy. That is to say that there are certain moments where you might feel deep intimacy and commitment, and there are certain moments where you take distance and it is an agon of a sort. So I would say that it isn't, I'm not to say that this is we must do an activist social science or whatever, or activist anthropology. I think there is, if one was to say there is such a thing as activism, certainly a relation of friendship and of distance.
Okay, I just had one last question before we wrap up. And this is something that we've been, I guess it's been coming up in conversation with a lot of the other people who've come for table talks, which is this question of the local. And I'm thinking in the context of human-animal relations as well, the local is important because the local is a place of difference, and it's also a place where you can analyze things in detail. But so, and I was thinking about this book by Deborah Birdrose, Wild Dog Dreaming, where she's talking about her experiences with Aboriginal elders. And it seems like, you know, the local history of that particular place or the stories that come from it are kind of, they are lessons to think about extinction or love and so on. And I wanted to know how you think about the local or the history of Shahbad as you talked about it in the book, and how you think about it as an ethnography. What does the ethnography do? Is it a story to think about the political theology of the neighbor, or is it a reality? Is it a particular reality that must not be made allegorical to think about issues in some meta-ethical sense?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that the difference for me in this book is that I realized that the way in which people would think of the local was neither near enough nor far enough. That basically often when you'd have something like Tejaji, and anyone could tell you, even if you ask, say, a knowledgeable, say, village school teacher, that what is this shrine? Who is it for? Let's say Tejaji. Then you ask, what is Tejaji? Let's say it's a Rajasthani Lok Devta, folk deity. Now that is a local conception, but to my mind as an anthropologist, the whole task of this chapter was to break away from each of those terms, which may come from a locality, but our capacity as thinkers is precisely to create a new notion of locality. And so for me to realize that Tejaji's locality is not Rajasthan. Rajasthan firstly is a very recent invention of a term, means nothing in relation to Tejaji. Tejaji is from Nagaur, has a particular kind of linguistic inheritance. And Tejaji, as I'm saying, is better understood in relation to deities further west, that is among pastoral nomadic tribes who extend all the way much further on towards Iran, towards Central Asia. And so basically we understand Tejaji better when we understand Tejaji in relation to the locality of epics, that is the Indo-European epics, a version of which we might find in Ireland, is being transformed along those same elements of snake, cow, life, etc., neighbor, antagonism, in a specific locality. Now, what did it mean for me to reorient that locality? I would say the locality is particular roots, which may be mythological roots. At the same time, it may be a deeper immersion in, say, this Mathura, the main spirit medium whom I follow in this chapter. That what did I understand from Mathura's life as a Tejaji spirit medium in Kasba Nonera, a village where I lived, among other villages there, is that I got a richer sense of what it means to live this experience and what it means to, say, be an antagonist in particular social relation. And would I have got to the Indo-European myths without Mathura? Probably not, because watching those antagonisms, I realized the significance of, say, Bruce Lincoln writing on the Greek Indo-European cattle raid. Or so sometimes the local for me is a resonance. That is to say that it is the tracking of particular routes with evidence. That is, you can say that here is evidence for how you, as they do in comparative mythology, or as they do in ritual, or as they do in saying that basically here is a ritual formation, which you can understand when they're saying, when they use a very local term like the besandar, which is the smoke that goes up when you burn a fire of cow dung and ghee, when somebody is telling you that this is like a mobile to the deities. Now, to understand that in relation to what role a sacrificial fire may have in ancient Greece, I think is a different notion of locality. At the same time, as you understand that, okay, here is, say, the local MLA coming to offer something to Tejaji, and the local MLA belongs to the Nagar or Kirar, whatever, the dominant cultivator caste, or the landed, not the dominant. And here is Saria spirit medium. Then you understand a little better that here are the ways in which an antagonism might play out. So what I'm saying is that basically the concept of the local for me was to break away from a very middle plateau notion of the local. That here is Rajasthan and here is folk and here is deity. So like I'm saying that the task of this kind of anthropological work was to go nearer and further. That is, with Rajasthan folk deity, you wouldn't really care that here is Mathura, here is this, and here is like the Kasparno-Nera politics and whatever. So we are going a little nearer than a, say, notion of India, Rajasthan, to particular experiences. And we're going further in terms of the history of morality or myth. So I would say that the notion of the local sometimes when it's tied to, say, the national or the regional or a very statist or colonial conception of region can be very limiting in the sense of the notion of locality.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. That was wonderful. Thanks everyone for turning up and for being here with your questions. We hope to see you again in another edition of the Table Talk. Thanks a lot, Bhrigu.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Anu, and I'll keenly follow this book, which seems so interesting, and thank you for engaging so closely with the thoughts in this book. It's really a gift.
All right, bye everyone.